Hello and welcome. My name is Sean and I am the founder of Share Training. I'll tell you a little bit more about me in a moment, as well as introduce you to my colleague. But to begin with, I just want to welcome you to the first webinar in a three-part series on evolving a trauma-informed service environment. And as you can see there, what we're going to be focusing on is a refresher on trauma concepts and also some general concepts to support the healing of trauma. What's ahead in webinar 2 and 3, and 2 we're going to get into some role-specific approaches to supporting healing trauma, which will be more specific in regards to what to do about our understanding of trauma within our role. And on webinar 3, we'll be getting into how do we create a service environment that's trauma-informed and healing focused across the board, from leadership to direct service providers to support staff and all around. The trauma concepts that we'll be exploring today include how trauma impacts a person's worldview, results in adaptive behaviors, affects the wiring in humans' brains, results in triggers, and repeating the cycle, which we'll be referring to with scripts. And so now I'll invite you into our shared conversation on trauma concepts. Hi, and thanks so much for joining us for this webinar on healing trauma. My name is Sean, and this is my friend and colleague Marianne, and I'm the founder of Share Training, which is an organization dedicated to helping entities, programs, systems, agencies, individuals establish very simple and doable trauma-informed approaches to care. I'm an integrationist, and what that means to me is that I'm really interested in how various human service approaches play together, and what that chiefly relates to in regards to our discussion today is I'm super interested in trauma and how other approaches help support us behavioralizing those values. For me, my journey of learning about trauma, which has been about 2 decades, has really been about understanding how it manifests in this human, and then how do I show up as a service provider or a leader of teams or a support staff member to ensure that this person experiences safety and trust. So that's kind of what I'm about, and I'm going to let you hear about Marianne now.
I'm an art therapist working in a psychiatric setting, and my primary focus in that psychiatric setting is not only to work with clients on trauma resolution, identifying those traumatic factors and then figuring out a way to resolve them, but also focusing on what happens next, the well-being aspect. And part of my focus is also on encouraging people to move from surviving to thriving, and helping staff to understand the behaviors involved when someone has had a traumatic experience, what that might look like, how it impacts direct service staff, and then how they can practice a model of self-care that will help move them through other people's trauma, help them to support others who are experiencing trauma, and see what is triggering in their own traumas, the scripts that have developed for them, and how they can navigate those so that they can also work towards well-being in order to hold space for traumatized persons.
Yeah, and one of the things that I want to share with you is that the way we're approaching this webinar is very much as a conversation about these concepts, and we'll dial into some specific pieces that you may be able to take into your setting. But one of the trauma concepts that I wanted to ping in on right now that you just brought up is the idea of scripts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. The idea of scripts came through as I started to put together a trauma resolution model, working with folks who have trauma that they are continually engaged in negative self-talk. It's a very pervasive issue. It's ubiquitous, that our mind fills in with negative thoughts of the things we're doing wrong, the ways that we aren't doing things right, that I'm not good enough. We're seeing more and more people with perfectionistic tendencies, and how that comes across. And what I see in folks who identify as being perfectionistic, the other spectrum of perfectionism is laziness. I'm either going to overachieve or I'm not going to achieve at all. And so what I see when I do a trauma timeline with my clients is that in that exploration of how did this behavior manifest is a series of things that we have told ourselves over time. So the things that come in from exploring our traumas, traumatic events, losses, etc., is the development of phrases like, I don't matter, I'm not important, I'm not good enough. And what happens when my clients experience trauma and we start to explore this, they ask me things such as, why do I keep experiencing trauma in my life? And what we've uncovered is that they are in some degree experiencing trauma, but really what's happening is they're experiencing things that are reigniting these scripts. So if you have a script that says, I don't matter, we will automatically, as people, the way our mind is wired, find validation from how I don't, for how I don't matter. And as we go through life, we will have other experiences that will then validate this belief.
Yeah, and we kind of frame this under the concept of repeating the cycle.
Yes.
And I really love how you put so much of that. And the way I think about it is I think about passive aggressive, right? The basic presentation of someone that has experienced trauma, maybe just a little bit or even a lot of it, is that they're either passive to things or they're aggressive in response to things. Where in the middle is assertiveness, where I can own myself and my strengths, and I can just say what I need, what I want, in a very kind of even keel tone. And I am working on that right now. And one of the things that's super interesting about it is this pendulum that swings. And for how this relates to trauma survivors to becoming thrivers, I love how you put that too, is that I need to find that my path to being assertive, where I don't have to fight for everything, or I don't have to cower or hide.
Right. And when we think about what happens in experiences of trauma, is that those two things happen, right? The fight, flight, or freeze aspect of things. I'm either going to cower away, freeze, disappear, or I have to fight for my survival. And those scripts develop in those time frames because the brain is remarkable and it helps us to survive. It puts us in that survival mode. So if I have learned to be safe by making myself small and disappearing and becoming wallpaper, I don't matter, whatever I do is not going to impact anyone, that in a way is keeping me very safe.
It has served us. It has served the person that's behaving that way, which could be any one of us. And it doesn't have to be a client, right? That's why this is important for us all to know in regards to our work with each other, our relationships with other, etc.
No matter what your trauma, no matter what your loss or your experience, everyone comes to the table with a unique experience, something that is specific to their life experiences. But the scripts that everyone comes to because of these experiences are all the same. So whether you've experienced trauma because you felt you didn't matter, and you know your sibling was born and all of a sudden that validated your belief that you don't matter, or you had to advocate and fight for yourself in a violently abusive family, and that your results of this didn't have an impact on stopping the violence, so you don't matter there. So you can see two extreme examples of the same script. So even though we all come to the table with a unique experience, one of the reasons we can talk about trauma in the general time frame is that we have similar scripts that come. And so because we have similar scripts, there are ways that we can operate from the provider aspect that can address those scripts and can address the commonalities that those unique experiences share.
I think this is super important for two reasons. One is I'm not a clinician. I was effectively a case manager that went on to do other things. You are a clinician, and what you're saying applies to both of us. So if I'm a non-clinical provider, what I'm gathering from what you're sharing is that if I know these basic presentations and expressions of trauma, then I can figure out how do I hold space, another important term that you brought up earlier, to help this person feel safe in my service environment and do the things that we need to do together.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So if we understand the expression of trauma, mm-hmm. how it manifests in our behaviors, what's happening in the internal mind, the negative mm-hmm. thoughts that come in, what that might look like, again, in our behaviors, as you said, mm-hmm. any person can help. Any person can work with that person by, as you said, holding space, but also by having a sense of compassion, and understanding, and I think that those are the key things. So when we approach, as anyone, whether we're a direct service provider or not, that we can approach people with a sense of compassion and mm-hmm. understanding and empathy to say, I don't know what your story is,
right? But
I'm going to listen to your story, and I'm going to listen. I'm going to hold that space so you feel safe enough. And what that does is almost immediately starts to resolve one of those factors of trauma. So when we can start to listen to people, mm-hmm. another person who has a story to tell, that allows them to feel safe enough to share their story. And that's one of those resiliency factors, or one of the factors in trauma resolution, is allowing the person to feel safe enough. So mm-hmm. you don't have to be a clinician to hold space for someone enough that they can feel safe. Really, that takes...
You don't. And I can validate that, and a lot of other people out there can validate that as well. Healing trauma happens in relationship.
Yes.
And that relationship can be a 5-minute check-in. It can be an hour and a half intake. It can be any amount of time where we give that person a safe harbor where they can feel safe for another human and talk out something that they need to talk out. And I think you gave 2 great descriptions of the underlying vibe to that, and that is compassion and empathy. And my simple and specific definition of empathy is deep understanding. So I can kind of surface level understand things, but if I deeply understand it and I can demonstrate to the person that I'm getting it from their perspective, then this allows them to feel heard. This allows them to go deeper with their vulnerability, because that's another big piece of what you're saying. I want to touch on a piece of brain science that I feel like you're bringing up. Is there's the verbal and nonverbal areas of the brain. And the verbal area is in charge of recording time as linear, beginning, middle, and end. What happens when someone experiences a deep trauma is that the verbal side of the areas of the brain go offline, and the nonverbal areas take over, which makes sense to me because this is also known as the creative area of the brain. And so I'm encountering this unique, novel situation I've never encountered before, this moment of powerlessness. And so I need my creative faculties to take over. The challenge for that is also that the nonverbal brain is in charge, experiences time as now. It's always now in the nonverbal brain. And this, by the way, is all validated by Jill Bolte-Taylor, who is a neuroanatomist who studies the anatomy of neurons and brains, and she had a complete left side stroke, and this put her in to her nonverbal brain, where she kind of was until she was able to come back and rewire her brain, which is another important part we'll talk about here in a bit, concept of neuroplasticity, but to the point where she did a TED Talk and wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight, and reads the book on Audible, which is how I experienced it. So she came all the way back.
The verbal side of the brain is the linear, the time, the logic, yes. And the creative, nonverbal, the creative side is also emotions.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a really key understanding when people do experience that fight, flight, or freeze. And the reason we talk about these 2 sides of the brain and how difficult it is to get them to communicate to each other, and the necessity of our brain to do this.
Yeah.
I think in terms of, I like to talk about bear attacks, because hopefully nobody that we're addressing has had the incident, a run-in of a bear. It's terrifying, but hopefully it's benign. Nobody's had this experience. I have had a bear experience, but I can talk about it. It's okay.
That's another story.
It's another story for another time. Yeah. But if we see a bear, you're right, we're out for a walk and a bear crosses our path, our brain has to immediately decide what to do. Mm-hmm. And if our brain engages in that conversation of, oh my gosh, it's a bear. Is it a brown bear or a black bear? Am I supposed to run? Or is this the one where I climb a tree? Do I zigzag? No, that's an alligator.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see where thought interrupts our immediate survival ability.
Mm-hmm.
And so the brain, to save us, shuts that time frame down. It shuts the language down, and it immediately goes into an emotional response, which is I have to fight, flight, or freeze. The brain automatically knows what to do. It may not be the right thing, but we have to assume that since we're all here, the brain has done the right thing.
Right.
And it's chosen for us, and it has chosen well. But we're left with this raw emotion, and we don't have words for it. And so it's an uncomfortable feeling. And if you think about situations where you haven't had words, and oftentimes it sounds like this: I don't even know what to say. I'm so devastated. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say here. Or it might even be elation.
It might be like,
I'm so excited for you. I don't even know what to say. Right. So we're telling a truth in that moment that we literally don't have words because the emotional part of our brain has taken over the language side.
Yes.
So when we experience these things, when people have trauma and they experience this stuck with the raw emotion, they will do anything to make that go away because we are a language. We are language creatures, and logic and time also. So,
and whether it's verbal language or sign language or any other kind of language, this applies.
Absolutely. And so the self-repair looks like over-intellectualization. It can look like I'm going to drink or drug the emotions away. I'm going to undereat. I'm going to overeat. It's about gaining control. It's about trying to feel connected again to something because we feel disconnected. We feel out of control. We feel I don't want to say disenfranchised. That's the wrong word. Disjointed.
Yeah, we've torn apart.
Yeah, we feel torn apart. And so we're trying to reconnect with the language side and we're trying to reconnect with the emotion side, but what's happening is that we're only doing one at a time.
We're kind of a pendulum that's swinging around in a hurricane.
Yeah.
And so this helps me, these concepts you've shared in regards to how challenging all the things that are going on are when someone shows up grumpy. And I recognize right away that my job is just to not push against that or even fix it, but as you've said before, hold space so the person can settle in. And we'll get on to some of these specific concepts in a bit. But I want to wrap up in regards to the verbal nonverbal brain, because since the verbal brain goes offline, what's happening is that you don't get the trauma recorded as beginning, middle, and end over. And what happens is it is recorded by that nonverbal side and is spinning around in there like a dryer, tumbling over and over. And it's hunting around for anything like that bear. Now, the trick with the bear is that my brain cannot tell the difference between the fact that I'm being chased by a bear versus I'm experiencing an emotional trauma or some other type of trauma where I'm not physically threatened. It experiences the same, and so it reacts the same. And it sets off the same systems.
It does, and our thoughts can be connected. So the brain cannot tell the difference between us being chased by a bear and us having a thought about being chased by a bear. And so there's that validation, is that the script is going to come in, the emotion is going to come in, and the emotion and the creative side is always in now. And so I might not see a bear, I might not even have a thought about a bear, but I have something that's going to trigger that same emotion.
Our brains
that is unrelated. And what we'll talk about more eventually is reacting versus responding. So when we're in that emotional side, we react to things, and reacting is a trauma-informed behavior versus responding, where we take a pause, stop, see the situation for what it is, and respond to it accordingly. But a reaction is, think of knee-jerk reaction, right? Yeah, and it's the locomotive of all of those past emotions, all of those past traumas and traumatic experiences that is trying to keep us safe in this moment.
Right.
And so, bear.
And so we need to find a way to help it keep us safe in this moment in a healthy way, in a non-reactive way, which is the trauma talking. And that gets into the concept of healing trauma. Yeah. Trauma, the journey of resolving trauma is about healing trauma. And my example for this, what you may have heard, is that July 1st of 2019, I got the flu, and I was out the first day. I could barely, get out of bed. And the second day, I felt about 15% better, and I had some meetings. I'm like, I'm going to go to these meetings. So throughout the week, I was coping with my condition. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was 100% able to mow the lawn, do all the things. And so I'd healed from my condition. And so that's one of the key things that comes up for me in regards to trauma. Coping is getting by, which is sometimes super important. But the end result that we're looking for is to heal it so that people can return to themselves.
And I like the way you phrase that. I see it also in that same way as this course of healing. If I break my arm, I need a cast. That's that holding space that you talk about. And for me, what I've experienced with people with trauma is that we heal. The cast comes off. We heal. Like I broke my arm, and it X-rays now show there's no sign that it was ever broken. However, when it gets humid out, when the weather changes, the spot where it was broken aches. Yeah. Does it feel the same as when I broke it? No. Do I need another cast? No. But I need to recognize that that's that tender spot, and I kind of honor that and say, okay, this will pass. So healing is really in recognizing that the pain may come, it's not going to be as bad as it was, but that I'm ultimately okay. But ultimately I can move on. So one of the things I think about in healing trauma is so many times we're stuck in survival mode. We are just doing what we can to get by. Yep. And what that looks like is I'm not really having strong emotions one way or another. I don't feel joy. I can fake joy. It feels like I'm wearing a mask. Right. And it feels heavy. Yeah. And it feels, again, like my life is somehow incomplete. Like somehow it is not connected to me. Yeah. I'm doing these things, but I feel like I'm just doing these things. And we'll hear that language from people. And they'll say, well, I'm just doing what I have to get by. Or, I don't know, I feel fine. I feel okay. And they're in that survival mode. And what we're looking at is entering into thriving mode. And thriving mode is moving outside of I'm just doing things to get by to I am doing things I enjoy. And I'm actually enjoying life. Yeah. And even the hard parts, we'll talk about this later, but the finding the how do you phrase it? The treasure in trouble. That's judged by, Yeah, and I call it the paradoxic learning, that through these dark, hard times, we actually learn some things that we weren't aware that we were learning, and that's how we know that we are in thriving mode, because we can look back at that and say, wow, it's really strong. Wow, am I resilient? And that carries us forward in a way that feels good versus just doing the next thing. Yeah. The other thing that when I'm sitting down with folks with this awareness that we're kind of refreshing on about how trauma works on people is to also have, for me, if I'm going to hold space for someone, I need to hold the belief that this person is not their trauma, that they're capable of achieving the purposefulness that you were just describing, and that they're capable of healing, and with some reasonable support sometimes, but more than not on their own, they can sew those bones back together. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's people are not their trauma, and so often they identify as that. They identify as what's wrong with me. And one of the things that you and I have talked about in other conversations is to approach people not as what is wrong with that person, but what happened. What's your story? And then hold that space for them to tell that story. In the clientele that I work with, I often hear them talk about themselves as their diagnoses. I don't have depression, I am depression. And that's not true. People are not their trauma. The trauma is one thing that happened that has carved away a part of the diamond, and the healing aspect of it is looking at the things that have happened as facets of the diamond of our life, and we're trying to polish them, and that's the healing process, is polishing that diamond and saying, no, this is a brilliant life that I have.
Yeah. Because one of the things that comes up for folks is if they are not considering what's happened that's resulting in these adaptive or self-repair behaviors that I want to let go of and change and heal from, then they're not going to do those things. And sometimes folks need us to help them see that in a different way, to help them understand that there's nothing wrong with them, that their systems and their bodies and their behaviors are a response to this wound that hasn't healed yet. And the true story of trauma is a story of resilience. Yeah. And what that means to me, again, you may have heard this one, but James Ardoti, at the age of 14 in 1968, lived in a small town in Southern California. And he was often in charge of going down to the bar to make sure his dad wasn't drinking down the rent money. And he was also in charge of putting up with his dad when he wasn't drinking, because he was very verbally abusive. He was in charge of getting his mom to the hospital during one of her multiple suicide attempts, because she was chronically depressed. And he was also in charge of putting up with the doctors who became dismissive of his mom's multiple suicide attempts. At the age of 13, he was in charge of fending off the bullies from his brother. His older brother, who self-identified as gay, and in 1968 was closeted, and the bullies were constantly after him. And so James Ardoti was in charge of fending off the bullies. He also had a fascination with magic, and he had this plastic thumb in which he would hide handkerchiefs and whatnot, pull them out, and do little magic tricks. And one day he lost his plastic thumb, and this made him very sad. He went on a bike ride around his town, and he ran into this magic shop that he'd never seen before. And he goes in, and there's an elder woman sitting behind the counter, and he says, "Do you have any plastic thumbs?" And she says, "I don't know. It's actually my son's shop. He's off to get us some lunch. I'm his mom. I'm just watching the store while he's away. I'm just here for the next 6 weeks hanging out." Now, being an elder woman, she saw James Ardoti for the discombobulated 13-year-old that he was, because by this point he had punched a nun, gotten kicked out of a couple schools, and as he self-describes, he was very much on his way to becoming a juvenile delinquent. And so she turns to him and she says, "You know what? If you come back tomorrow, I'm going to teach you some real magic that you can really use." And this intrigued him, so he showed up the next day, and for the next 6 weeks, she taught him a particular type of meditation, which includes setting intention and opening your heart and some other things. And now James Ardoti is a pediatric neurosurgeon, hangs out with the Dalai Lama, and started the Center for Compassion and Altruism Studies at Stanford University. So his is a story of resilience, of healing to a place where he can be on purpose and be who he is and manifest really awesome things. Yeah.
That's a beautiful story.
Yeah,
I didn't know that story. That's a very cool one.
Yeah.
And I think of, what does resiliency look like?
Right.
And resiliency looks like self-efficacy, of being able to respond versus react, of living a life that you feel is on purpose. And on purpose doesn't always mean a divine plan. It could be, I don't know, but it is doing things intentionally. I am intentionally doing these things to achieve this end result, and often that end result that we're trying to achieve is joy or happiness or well-being, being present with other people. When we're in trauma, we can't necessarily do that.
Yeah.
When we're in a trauma mindset, it's really hard to be present when you're constantly on the alert for more danger coming your way.
Yeah. And the other thing to think about in regards to the brain science is that if I'm triggered, I'm in my lower brain, which is my fight or flight brain. If I need to reason through something or think through something, I've got to have access to the thinking through things part of my brain. And I can only do that if I can find a way to settle this down. Sometimes others can help me remember that I need to settle this down, but it's really me doing the work of settling this down. It's me choosing to do that. So how does, in regards to healing trauma, the journey is, as you've put it, going from a survivor mode to a thriver mode. And so tell me more about that distinction.
Sure. So the survival mode, when a person is in survival mode, again, they're doing what they can to get by. And oftentimes they're engaged in those behaviors that we had just talked about, the self-repair behaviors, and many times they're unaware of it as well. So moving into thriving, I think I had a client say it to me best, and she said it recently as we went through kind of the trauma recovery model or the repair model, and we did this, identified the scripts and then identified the paradoxic learning. And she said, all this time I have just been a tree of trauma, a tree of trauma, a tree of trauma. And she could only see these trees and not see the forest for the trees. And when we were done, she said, I've just seen these trees and now I finally see there's a whole forest of my strength. And so that to me is moving into surviving mode or thriving mode, that all of a sudden she is taking ownership of her choices. So she's feeling empowered about what she does, that she is doing more of what she loves to do and less of what she doesn't love, right? She's having a healthier relationship with herself. We've sort of quelled those negative scripts.
So in regards to this forest of resilience, that's really the point we're making in regards to all of this, is that when I can look at the pain that I've experienced as something that has made me stronger, that because it didn't kill me, as Jojo Pop puts it, treasure in trouble, and as you're putting it, thriving. That's where paradoxical learning is how you put it. Then that results in me being a place where I can thrive, where I can really tune into myself and who I am and what I want to do with my strengths and capacities.
And I can be more present. I'm more present to you. I'm more present to you. I'm more present to myself.
Yeah.
I can identify how I'm feeling. I'm not going to be in a Pollyannic bliss bubble. Great if I could all the time, right?
Yeah.
But we have good days and we have bad days.
Sure.
But the bad days don't get us stuck. The bad days don't leave us in that self-repair mode. The bad days, it's reminds me of John Kabat-Zinn's mountain meditation.
Yeah.
So when I'm in thriving mode,
Yeah.
The meditation talks about you becoming the mountain and the base of who you are versus the things we experience, our weather on the mountain. And so when I'm in survival mode, all I experience is the weather on the mountain, and I can't see the mountain. I can't experience this solid base of who I am. But when I'm in thriving mode, I start to recognize my core values. I start to recognize my own strength, my own resilience, which is self-efficacy and empowerment. I start to recognize that I'm a really compassionate person. And I learn this, the paradoxical learning. I learn how to be compassionate because I don't want anyone to experience what I experienced, right? And then once we get to that place, and we're like, this is the base of the mountain, I can then experience other experiences and emotions, even strong emotions like loss and maybe another trauma, as weather on the mountain.
Yeah.
Okay, this is going to pass. And where I live now in North Carolina, there's a lot of mountains, and it's a great metaphor because there are days when you can drive into the mountains and not see them because the weather is so thick. And I think so many times when people experience trauma, they can't see the mountain.
Yeah.
The weather's too thick. They experience the snowstorm or the rainstorm or the deluge, and it's hard to connect with. Or they may experience something like, I am, Mount St. Helens. I just blew my top, and a part of me, I'm damaged. And when we start to look at the base of the mountain, sitting in who we are, who we know we are, that part of us that never changes despite or regardless of the experiences we've had, that we can recognize that we are stronger than we realize, that we are smarter than we realize, that we are much more communicative than we once were, and we recognize that we have this stability in us of being a good human being. And when I reference Mount St. Helens, right, we look at Mount St. Helens now,
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful park. The mountain is still there. It has a teeny tiny, actually, divot.
Yeah.
If you look at it from a distance. It's a divot. It's huge. It's 1,300 feet. It got chopped off the top of the mountain when it exploded. But the mountain itself is still there. Mount St. Helens still exists. And it's green. It's lush. It's beautiful. It's vibrant. And that is Mount St. Helens thriving.
Yeah.
It has come back to life. It has experienced new growth. It's gorgeous.
Yeah. It has healed its wound.
It has healed its wound, yes.
Yeah. I want to just invite you to tell one more story because you do it so well.
Oh, thank you.
And this is about strawberry popcorn seeds. Yeah.
Yeah. But the strawberry popcorn seed or the seed is hard. Like if you grab popcorn kernels and you would notice that the seed is incredibly hard. And when we apply heat to those popcorn seeds, right, they explode. However, if we plant the seed and we plant it in the composting soil of everything that has gone before us, all the, I'm just going to say compost so I don't swear on the webinar, but it's all the it's all the stuff that has gone before, the decomposing leaves, the trauma the tree has experienced, the ground has experienced, the soil, the stuff that we feel like no longer holds value, the rotting produce, if you will.
Right. When it does,
And so it composts and makes this rich soil. So we plant the seed in this rich soil and it's still hard. And now it's hard and it's in the darkness. And I think a lot of times people feel that that's where they are. They're just in this dark and they can't break out of it and they can't change. And it is through watering, and sometimes the watering comes through in tears. Sometimes it is other people's tears. Sometimes it is our own. And so we water the seed in this darkness of everything that has gone before. And what starts to happen is the hard outer casing of the popcorn seed starts to soften.
Yeah.
And the seed doesn't realize that it's softening.
Yeah.
It just knows it's experiencing something that it hasn't before.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely this little sprout comes up, and the sprout doesn't necessarily know. I mean, I've not talked to popcorn seeds, so maybe it does know, I'm not sure. Or if I've talked to them, they haven't answered. But the sprout is coming through the soil, and how much energy and effort it takes to come out of that shell and work its way through the soil. It just knows that there's this hope that I'm going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And it breaks through the soil and it literally sprouts leaves.
Yeah.
Almost magically, almost overnight, right? And I feel that trauma and trauma healing, trauma resolution is the same way. Like when we have that hard shell and we have that, we're stuck in the darkness of all of that stuff, how much energy it takes to soften that outer shell and to work towards something that we almost have faith in that exists, but we haven't seen it. We don't know. We're still in the dark until we get to the other side of it, and then we can really blossom and grow.
We can see the forest for the trees.
We can see the forest for the trees. We can see the forest of our strength and resilience for the trees of our trauma. Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. So as we've touched on, the 5 big ways that trauma matters are it influences my worldview. So if I've experienced the world as a dangerous place, I'm going to treat it as a dangerous place.
May I add something in there?
Please.
Yes, if I experience the world as a dangerous place, I'm going to have a worldview.
Right.
But let's say that your parents saw the world as a dangerous place.
Right.
And this is where the importance of trauma reconciliation, of healing our trauma, is so necessary. Because if we grow up in an environment of parents who have experienced trauma and it's not resolved, we grow up, maybe we haven't had a trauma, but our parents have, and so they teach us the world is an unsafe place because they haven't resolved their trauma, and so it trickles down to the next generation, and we don't know why the world feels unsafe. We don't know why we're frightened all the time. We just know that that's the model that was set for us.
Righto. And that's why cycle breakers, people that resolve these scripts you've been referring to, that go through the process of healing the trauma and do not pass it on to their families, are super brave and courageous people that really are a testament to this concept of thriving versus surviving, and resilience, and all the things that we've been sharing. Trauma results in adaptive behaviors. And so if I am experiencing this emotional or sometimes physical or psychological pain or a mixture thereof, because I've experienced powerlessness over my body or my mind or my emotions or who or what I am, my identity, then I'm going to take care of that however I can. And might include isolation, alcohol and drugs, not taking my medications as prescribed, any of the behaviors that you're likely encountering. Some people, because of the instance of their trauma, and I'm just pulling this out of hat, might have an aversion to taking a shower. All these things are adaptive behaviors.
Yeah, they are definitely adaptive behaviors, and some of those adaptive behaviors look like maybe giving a person a stiff arm in a relationship.
Sure, yeah.
Or engaging in relationships that will end because you can predict that outcome.
Right.
So we look at how those adaptive behaviors impact not only the relationship we have with ourselves and our own self-care, but how that impacts our relationships with other people. Adaptive behaviors, that is one of the adaptive behaviors that we hear often about, especially in today's world, is codependency. And so I'm going to enter into an unhealthy relationship, trying to fix or save the other person. I'm going to take on more for myself.
Because that will allow me to feel wanted.
Yes.
Right.
And then I'll matter.
Yeah. I'll matter.
So that too is an adaptive behavior.
We also touched on brain development already, which is one of the other 5 big ways that trauma matters. Triggers, which we've been kind of hinting at throughout. If I've got this invisible wound, this cycling that's happening, like the dryer we referred to, it's going to that re-experiencing of powerlessness, no matter what version it comes out in, is going to set off my alarm system. I'm going to go back into my fight, flight, or freeze mode and present as aggressive or passive or a little bit of both.
Sometimes those triggers are going to be so subtle that we're unaware. It might be, just as an example, maybe my parents were in a violent relationship, and for me, I would go into a flight, right? I would mentally leave, but maybe I would have a pencil or a stuffed bear or something. I had something, a transitional object that I held onto that made me feel safe. But now when I have that transitional object, or if I see that transitional object, with that comes all of the emotions that I experienced during that trauma. So now I have an adversity towards stuffed animals because I had my comfort bear, right? Yeah. Or I have an obsession with stuffed animals because I want to feel safe, and so I have a whole room. I have a whole room full of stuffed animals, right? Or, if maybe I was coloring while this, an incident happened, now I pick up my color pencils and immediately I don't know why I'm uncomfortable, but I hate art, right?
Yeah. And sometimes it is that clear a connection, sometimes it's not, you know? That's really the insidiousness of it. I may have a room full of stuffed animals, just so you know. And then we've touched on repeating the cycle. So you'll recall the most commonly embraced values of a trauma-informed care implementation are safety, trust, collaboration, transparency, empowerment, and cultural, historical, and gender responsiveness. And we're going to be exploring some specific ways in specific role types, how it is that we can behave in a way, be in a way with the folks that we're serving, with each other, to embrace these values. So we've been kicking around all this stuff in regards, all these concepts in regards to neurobiology and trauma and healing and all that. So what does that have to do with someone who's trying to get a job?
Well, first to understand that person may have lost their job.
Right. And
that is traumatic in itself. Any major life change, any change, we don't do well with change, just because it's novel and it's difficult and can bring back, like a trigger, can bring back some of those traumatic experiences. So to understand that someone may have lost a job prior to coming to you, and that may have been a trauma. But then to come in and talk to someone about finding a job, and talk about skills that I don't believe I necessarily have, because I have that negative script in my head from those past traumas. But also to understand that because I may have had these traumatic experiences and I may still be holding on to these negative scripts, that there may be a lot of shame, which is often associated with trauma, right? There may be a lot of shame in coming and talking to someone about what are my next steps. And so as an employment specialist, to hold that space for them, to hear their story, and to have that great understanding and compassion that there's more to that person than just what's sitting in front of you at that desk. There's a story behind that, and there may be some unintended emotions that are showing up in the office. And they may benefit, the person coming to you. And again, this goes for any role that you have, any people, you might be sitting next to someone on a bus, but to understand that there's a more complex story there. And that some of the behaviors you may experience in listening to that person or being witness to that person might be trauma informed. They may benefit from some grounding techniques. This is a really daunting thing. It can provoke anxiety looking for work. And anxiety will bring with it that locomotive of all the traumatic experiences that have caused me anxiety in my past. Right? So that thought of I'm having anxiety is going to bring everything with it. And so to allow a person, I think we talked a little bit about the approaching someone with curiosity versus judgment. Would be the first thing. And then holding space while they share their story so that they feel safe enough. And offering them some compassion as to maybe there's a deeper story here that went on, but understanding that they're coming to you, maybe they've lost a job, or maybe they've had a hard time finding it, or maybe they, we don't know the circumstances of what brings them into the office specifically. And how we can work with them is to give them some tools to calm themselves.
Such as the grounding technique and the big piece that you're bringing up for me is the concept of powerlessness, because that's my simple and specific definition of trauma. I've experienced powerlessness over my body of what I am, and then when that gets triggered, such as losing my job, then I can go back into this mode. And so it's important for me as a provider to understand that, and also have the capacity to hold space, which is this beautiful mixture, as you're putting it, of curiosity and empathy. And then there are certain verbal behaviors. So like when I hear curiosity, the verbal behaviors I express curiosity with are questions. Tell me more about that. And also when I'm expressing curiosity, sometimes I'm helping the person be curious about it themselves just by asking this question. The verbal behavior that I align with empathy is reflection. And this is where I guess what it's like to be this person based on what they're implying by their presentation and or their words, tuned into my intuition. I connect those together, and out comes a reflection. And so that might sound like, this is a really challenging time for you, because you're not quite sure how you're gonna pay the bills while you're working on getting a job, based on what the person said. And this can really allow the person to feel held by us, which is super important.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point. What that person might be verbally communicating or non-verbally communicating. We talked about those internal scripts. So to have someone hold space and to listen and to understand that this person might be having this internal script that says it doesn't matter what it doesn't matter what I'm going to do because I'm just going to screw it up anyway. Like, I am a screw up is one of those common scripts. I am a failure. I'm not good enough. And they might shoot for employment lower than their skill set. They might not recognize their skill set because that would be a positive attribute. So if I'm in a trauma brain, I don't think I have any skills.
Right.
So to understand the way that trauma informs really subtle behaviors and subtle interactions and the resistance that people will feel moving into change. I'm here to help you find a new job. What's the point?
And what you're bringing up for me is that in order to be a person that expresses curiosity and empathy in a skillful and intentional way, I have to be a really good listener. And I listen not only with my ears, but also with my eyes, as you're pointing out, and my energy too, my radar. And really kind of tune into my gut a lot as I'm listening. The other thing that comes up for me is that, like I used to be a job developer and a job coach for folks with different abilities. And so the job developer piece is like I'm interacting with businesses. And I didn't know a lot of this stuff when I was a job developer. And where my brain goes now is that this can be very beneficial to job developers understand, or business owners and managers understanding, because it's not only about helping the person feel safe within their environment, but also their whole team. And because retention is a huge piece of any place of employment. And one of the important concepts that I think we need to connect with specifically in regards to that is the concept of neuroplasticity. And you have such a great way of describing how those pathways go. And so, if you wouldn't mind.
What we've learned is that the brain is much more malleable and adaptive physically than what we once believed. So when we're looking at neural pathways, let's say we have a negative thought. We've experienced a trauma. We know the chemicals are being released, right? The stress hormone and the numbing agents, right, to keep us safe. And in that, the development of the scripts that also helped keep us safe, right? So this kind of abstract thing. But when we have a thought, we have the neurons, right, that help create the thought throughout the brain. And they are, each of them coded in what's called a myelin sheath. And a myelin sheath is like if you picked up an electrical cord and it has the plastic wrapped around it, right?
Okay.
Around the copper wires. What that does is keeps the energy so that the energy can go from one point to the next point, right? Completing the circuit, if you will. And the thicker the cord, the faster the energy moves. It's insulation. So the same thing happens in our brain. Our neurotransmitters have this myelin sheath. And when we have a negative thought, the first time we have that thought, it's almost like it creates a walking path, a little path through a field. I have a negative thought. The next time I have that same negative thought, I have now created a little bit deeper path. The myelin sheath has thickened a little bit. If I continue to have that negative thought, I am creating what was a footpath into a dirt road, into a paved road, and eventually I have a super freeway. That negative thought will come without any effort. I won't invite it. It just shows up, and then it feels intrusive, invasive, and overwhelming because I've created this super freeway for it. So what happens in the care of trauma resolution and the various aspects of how we do that is that we start to show things like self-compassion. And self-compassion doesn't sound like, hey, I'm awesome, I'm great. But what it says is I showed up today. Like, I woke up today, that's good, right? And it just starts in these really small ways. So we start to create new neural pathways.
That's a footpath of compassion.
Yes, the footpath. Yes, thank you. We start to create the footpath of compassion, and more we practice that self-compassion, and now we have another super freeway. But this one is a positive thought, if you will. Well, the brain only has so much room upstairs for all these super highways, and so what happens is the highway that we're no longer using starts to disintegrate and develop potholes and grows little grass on the side, right? And eventually it's unusable.
And this is such a helpful concept that you're sharing with me, because where my brain immediately goes to when I hear stuff like this is, okay, what do I do about it? And one of the things that you was throughout the superhighway of negativity or self-compassion, which is a choice, as long as I know it's a choice, is the ability to pay attention to that which is awesome about me. And so let's say we've got a person here who's experienced trauma and they have this negative superhighway going on in their brain. Then I know that part of my job is to listen for and attend to any strengths and or efforts that the person has put forth. That footpath of self-compassion that you described, that self-efficacy, that empowerment. And so the footpath is that they showed up in my chair today. The footpath is that they thought about the thing that they were supposed to do the last time we were together, but they didn't do it, but they thought about it. Okay. Like I was sitting down with effectively a person that had been in and out of residential treatment tens of times and relapsed obviously many times. And during the course of this 5-minute conversation, she said, you know, I was clean for 90 days, but that's it. And my response to her was, what, you were clean for 90 days? How did you do that? Right? So when we help the person observe strengths as strengths, then we can also help them start to pay attention to how that strength has shown up, where it can take them, how it can help them heal through their trauma, how it can help them manifest in behavior change that helps them move forward with their lives in a way that is purposeful.
Hi, everyone. This is Beth Gertner. I work at SBRI. First of all, thank you for joining us today for the Q&A portion of the webcast. We have both Sean and Marianne available to answer your questions. And also thank you to everybody who has popped in a question. There are a couple that ended up in the chat, a couple of comments, questions. So they're in a couple different places. So if we do not get to them all, we will circle back around to you via email. We just have a little bit limited amount of time. So if we don't reach out to you during this portion, we will definitely be reaching out via email. And so I guess we'll just start with the first question here. The first question is, any suggestions or approaches on how we can help people change their scripts?
Marianne, would you like that, or would you like me to go?
If you're all right, I'll start with that one.
Yeah.
All right. Changing scripts is a very hard thing to do because a lot of times people don't realize what their scripts are. So in order to change the script, we first have to become aware of what it is. So what is the negative self-talk that we're telling ourselves? And one of the things that we talked about in the video, and I continue to believe, is this act of self-compassion. So to allow people the sense of, you know, instead of trying to think of how to word this, engaging in that paradoxic learning will come later, but acting in that self-compassion, like, you know what, I showed up today. In Sean's example in the video was the person who had been clean for 90 days, right? How did you do that? So to help them find their strengths and to reiterate those strengths back to them and talk to them about, you know, we're going to work on this self-compassion, and self-compassion, again, isn't that Pollyannic bliss bubble, but it is being real with your accomplishments and your strengths. Sean, did you have more to add for that?
Well, I've got an actual question for you I want you to think about while I riff, and that is, how do you, because I know that you run groups with folks that have experienced trauma, and so what is a specific way that you help people wire that self-compassion neuron, so to speak? So I'll let you think about that for just a second. So how do we change scripts? So, you know, this comes back to the idea of cycle breaking. And so in order to change the script that I am in, I have to be aware that it is the trauma that I have not healed from that is implicitly cycling in the nonverbal areas of my brain. And there are various approaches to helping the person rewire their brain in such a way that that is not owning them anymore. And one of the specific interventions that I've come across is called the instinctual trauma resolution. And if you go to helpfortrauma.org, there'll be a bunch of videos and information, might be .com, I always mix it up, about how people can use art to unhinge this script and get to a place where it is over and done with, where they experience it as a past thing rather than a current thing. Elizabeth, is that making sense in response to the question from your end?
I believe so. Also, just a reminder for everyone, if we do ask your question and you want to follow up, feel free to post another one, or also we will have contact information available when we send out the email after the webinar. So if you want to follow up via email, feel free to do that as well. But I believe are we good for the next question? Anything else, Sean or Marianne?
Well, Marianne, did you want to pop in on like specific ways that you lead your group to help them change out their scripts?
Yeah, I often talk about awareness is the first stage of change. And so again, we have to become aware of what those scripts are. For me as an art therapist, just like Dr. Linda Gant, who Sean referred to at the ITR, helpfortrauma.org or com, maybe it's not, I don't know. But we draw it out. We draw out a timeline, and then we can look at what we've been through, and then we start to engage in what did we learn from that. And the best example I have is not just the tree story, but another woman, we did this, another client, we did this timeline, and then we started to look at the strengths. And she said at some point, after we were done for a little while, and she said, she's a nurse, and she said, oh, one of my strengths is that I'm an incredible strategic planner. She's like, I'm always looking at how can I do this better? And what she had discovered is that her childhood of trauma helped prepare her for being an emergency room nurse. That she was so accustomed to this strategic planning of, what's the priority? How do I work in this? That it became a strength for her. So this is where that paradoxic learning, this is where when we look at these types of things, and really, it helps to have a therapist to talk to. It helps to have someone who can hold that space, which we'll address in a little bit. So that you can start to explore these things in the company of others. It's really hard to explore it on your own, and I don't recommend doing that because we need, as human beings, to be witnessed by someone. So to have a professional, a motivational interviewer, a social worker, a therapist, etc., to help hold that space for you and work through these things with you, bless you, is very important. I think that's it for that question.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up something that you helped me think of, and that is self-awareness. And one of the easiest paths for most people, but not all people, to become more self-aware of what thoughts are coming in and that they don't have to engage them is mindfulness, and some type of mindfulness practice, or even yoga, getting back into their body. Most trauma survivors have this tempest happening in their head. And so when we can slow down and tune in and allow us to be present with the thoughts that are coming in and not engage them, then this can help us settle us down. The reason that yoga is helpful is that when folks have experienced any type of trauma, sometimes they can lose touch with their body. And why that's important is that if I'm getting triggered and my shoulders are going up, my face is flushed, and I can't experience that, then I don't know that I can't tackle the trigger or address the trigger in advance of it starting to influence my behavior. So those are two additional things that I would add: mindfulness and yoga.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, the next question is, do you have any recommendations for interacting with a family member who has a few diagnoses and is pregnant with their fourth child, marriage that is trying to be repaired, dealing with the current health crisis, and so on? This person will continue to allow her anxiety to take control of her in all aspects. And that question comes from Jennifer.
Marianne, did you want to go first? You want me to?
Sure. Jennifer, thanks for your question. It sounds like this person, has a lot going on. I mean, anytime I think of anxiety, it's about getting really caught in the future and being overwhelmed by it. And it sounds like there's a lot of stressors in that person's life. And the best thing sometimes we can do as someone who is experiencing a relationship with someone who is having all these stressors or these past traumas. I don't know more about the situation, but it sounds like holding space and setting boundaries. Two really important things, to listen to the person, without judgment, to just kind of be curious as to what's going on. That person, if they're having anxiety, often they feel out of control, and not to control them, but to set up a boundary. Like, boundaries are our friends. Boundaries are, they help us step out of codependent relationships. They help us to feel more empowered ourselves. So for you as the person who is witnessing this, to have some boundaries, and then, offer, I don't know if it would be appropriate to offer, like, hey, maybe there's someone she can talk to maybe there's a support group, maybe there's a parents with 4 children support group. I don't know. But again, to hold that space, to listen with curiosity, to find out what's really going on, and to offer that support. A lot of times people feel very much alone in these experiences, but then to have those boundaries for yourself, and allow her those boundaries as well, and allow her a sense of control. Sean, what would you like to add?
Well, in regard to boundaries, that's really one of the things that we touched on in our recorded chat is being assertive. And so setting a boundary is hard. And Brene Brown does a great job of talking about this. She says that, when I set boundaries, I feel like I'm not being as nice, but I'm being far more loving and kind. And one of the challenges with boundaries is that it's hard for us to set them, because for some folks, we want to be liked, we want to be wanted. All these things kind of come up for us too. And so when I'm in a situation with someone who's in the middle of a tempest, it's important for me to be grounded first, before I go in and start to support them. In regards to this person's, it sounds like, underlying issue of anxiety, one of the things that I learned from exploring the instinctual trauma resolution model is that basically, if you open up the DSM-5, which is the big giant book that therapists use to identify whether I've got this or that, anxiety included, is that basically, if you pointed to any condition in there, that is a result of trauma. And that's why, one of the things that I'm sure we're going to define here in a second is the idea of holding space. But that's why it's so important to be, as Miriam is bringing up, a skilled listener to people first, and then help them find the pathway, whether it's mindfulness or doing the ITR or yoga or EMDR or brain spotting or something else, so that they can release that anxiousness and return to themselves.
All righty, thank you. The next question, ancestral trauma. After listening to the information provided on ancestral trauma, I would assume that this could be the case with numerous African Americans who are victims of slavery. And that question comes from Lakeisha.
Yes, and thank you, Lakeisha. That's important. Okay, if I go first on this one, Marianne?
Go for it, Sean.
Yeah, so Dr. Joy DeGruy is a great resource for this concept that you're bringing up, and she's written a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she also does a great job of explaining this, and I'd prefer to show you her talking about it than me talking about it. But what you're getting at is that trauma, as we identified and as you already know, comes in all sorts of forms. And when it has to do with my identity, this is huge. And so this is one of the reasons why it's important for us to be, when we're sitting with someone, to be culturally reverent and understand what Lakeisha brought up. And then is that there's a whole history of ancestral trauma given this person's identity, whether this person is of African American origin, or a part of the LGBTQ community, or Japanese American internment, on and on and on. And it's super important for us to be aware of that and to really hold space for that aspect of it as well.
Perfectly said. Perfectly said. Yep, couldn't have said it more beautiful. It's true. There's so many influences that come. When you ask someone, like, let's say it's an instance of abuse, which has always been more of my focus, intentional trauma. And you ask an adult child, like, why do you hit your kids? Well, that's how I grew up. So this is a repeating of the cycle. And then you ask the same person or a different person in the same family, why are you so passive? Like, you never hit your kids, you don't yell. And that person will say, because I grew up in an abusive family. So we can see where that person becomes that cycle stopper, but at the same time, they were informed by the behaviors that had gone before. So it's really important to look at a way a person behaves now is not only their own experiences, their own traumas or traumatic experiences, but they have been influenced by what they experienced via their parents, and their parents maybe experienced domestic violence growing up, and then they look at their grandparents and maybe there was some violence growing up, so these things get trickled down, and that's why we often talk about the cycle of trauma or the cycle of violence and trying to break it. But that ancestral piece is really important in looking at how we behave and interact and feel about ourselves today.
And as it relates to identity, one thing I want to add is that just because I'm a part of a given cultural group or I associate myself with a given cultural group does not mean that ancestral trauma is going to impact me. It might mean that it's going to impact me. So it's not 100% given. That's a super important thing to consider. I think we're back to you, Beth.
All righty. Next question. I had a strong suspicion there would be some questions about this particular topic. So many of us have to work from home right now. How do we make sure the trauma from our work life doesn't impact our personal life, since at this time the boundaries are blurred?
Yeah. So one of the things, and this kind of relates back to the ancestral trauma question too, one of the things is that the basic definition for me of trauma is powerlessness. We are all experiencing a moment of deep powerlessness. And so part of the challenge is that we can't quite get onto the healing part, in my opinion. And so what we need to do is we need to settle in with coping. And that is reasonably kind of getting by. And so everybody's context is different. And so we have to consider, what are our available resources. So like my daughter's been doing art. She's been making cards for people. This does two things. One is it gives her mind something to focus on, and it also gives her something where she's going to give these away. The positive cards to give away to people to help them focus on things. Going out in nature is super helpful to a lot of people if that's possible. We have a list of simple grounding techniques such as this, just holding on to ourselves. This can go back to the person that was experiencing anxiety with the fourth child on the way. Just going back, this can help us ground ourselves back in our body, can help us settle things down. And we have a long list of grounding techniques so that people can kind of pick out the ones that work for them. And if it'd be helpful, I'd be glad to ship it out to you, Beth, so that you can send it on to folks. Marianne, what would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I think the importance of just what you said too. We're all experiencing this together. It's a global thing, as we know, and I think it's really important when you're working from home to have some clear boundaries for yourself. We set up a schedule. Get up at a similar time. Doesn't have to be the same time, but get up at a specific time. Shower, get ready for your day, and act as if you are going to an office, and to take those breaks. Like, we now have an opportunity working from home where we can take a break. We also have an opportunity where we don't take breaks because work just continues. So it's really important to recognize, to set up a set schedule for yourself. It's, I've worked for 3 hours. I need to get up. I need to move around. Maybe I'll go outside for a little bit, and to set those boundaries between work and home. And if there's, kids at home that need your attention, to let them know, I need to do this until this time, but at this time to this time, I'm available for you. And it's hard when that trickles in, when you don't have that boundary anymore, but see what you can do. Maybe there's a space in your house, maybe there's not, but maybe there is a space that can be just yours for this temporary moment in time that you can use as an office. And if not, can it just be a block of time? Hey, from this time to this time, I need the dining room because y'all aren't going to be eating and I need to do some work. It really is about that communication part, about setting a schedule and kind of sticking to your similar routines, and allowing yourself those self-care practices. As Sean said, and as we all know, these are incredibly stressful times. And there's so much uncertainty. We are all stepping into this without uncertainty. We have more questions than we do answers. And so many of us are feeling this pervasive sense of lack of control. So what can we control in a healthy way? We can control a schedule. We can control when we do what we do, and we can control how we go about doing it. So these things are really important. If you're living by yourself, or if you're feeling that social isolation and you're working at home, how can you reach out to others? Again, the Zoom platform's been a fantastic help for me personally. Writing, making cards for others, doing altruistic things for other people can also help make us feel good. Like Sean's daughter, how beautiful. So there's things we can do that can sort of give us a sense of control. Little side story, as I've been home for the past 9 days, I was eating an apple on my first day home, and I took the seed and I stuck it in some dirt. I had a little pot of dirt, and that seed is now this little sprout that's about this big, and I was so excited. And so the question I keep asking myself as I'm at home are, what are the seeds that I'm planting here? What are the seeds that I'm planting for my future? How am I going to make that future a little bit less uncertain? And what can I do towards that? And so it's little things like that. It's starting to recognize, what am I doing now that will lead me to there later? And these are really large concepts. I feel like they're really broad for this short amount of time that we have. But again, it goes down to setting a routine, setting a schedule, and giving yourself a break, allowing yourself some self-care. Go outside for a walk, go out for a bike ride, go play with your kids if you have kids. There's a lot of, like, the museums are offering free tours, virtual tours, etc. So there's things that you can do that can pull you away from work in a healthy way, to give you, I don't know if I'm making sense, but to give yourself a break.
Sense. And the big thing that you're bringing up is structure. So having a structure that you can follow, and that can be different each day, but and this is the place I learned about this, was a place called Jasper Mountain Center, which is a residential treatment center for little kids 4 to 12 out on the side of a mountain in Oregon. And this is where I first started learning about trauma and its effect on humans and how to help heal it. And this was back in the mid 90s. And so they were trauma informed, I believe, before it even had a name. And when I first showed up there, and this was my first gig, in the human services, I was like, boy, this place is kind of regimented. Dinner happens at a specific time, rec happens at a specific time, and there's quiet time, and there's bedtime, and all these things. And what it was setting up to do, which I learned later, was that all the kids there had experienced extreme trauma, and so they were living in chaos prior to coming to Jasper. And so when we provided them with this structure, what allowed them to do is know what's going to happen next. And that is helping the person return to a sense of power. I know that at this time, this is what's going to happen. I know at that time, this is what's going to happen. So basically, any way that we can structure out our days and our times with each other and attend to each other in a kind of compassionate way, and ourselves in a kind of compassionate way, will help us settle down this lower brain that's going off for a lot of us, and help us continue to think through things.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Great point. It is. It's that structure helps us make things more predictable.
There you go, predictable.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually a good follow-up to the last question. Can you comment on the current worldwide situation, which you already have a little bit, and how this will, one, impact individuals who carry trauma, and two, are experiencing trauma due to significant social isolation? And that one comes from Harriet Ann.
Harriet Ann. Right. Thank you. Thank you for that question. If you don't mind, Sean, I'll jump in and I'll kick this one off. So when we look at the world situation and our own, how that impacts us personally, I think of people who have experienced trauma, and this is a global trauma. We are all experiencing, in essence, a major loss, a loss to our daily routines, a loss to the safety of what we knew what was, and it enters us into this unpredictability. So what I expect to see, right, what I have witnessed in friends and family, etc., is an increase in fear, an increase in anxiety, and an increase in sense of loneliness. So as people are more alone than ever before, with the social distancing. So what we can Oh, in the sense of feeling I took notes. So the sense of feeling overwhelmed and a sense of feeling out of control. And so when we look at those factors, like I don't feel safe because I've stepped into what is unpredictable. I don't have any answers. I feel isolated and alone. I feel overwhelmed, and I feel like things are out of control. We can start to address those kind of working backwards. If I feel out of control, what can I control? Let's go back to the schedule, the structure, and the routine. I can set that up in place. Let's go back to the feeling of overwhelmed. Overwhelmed is something is too big. What can I break down into smaller pieces? And again, it helps to have that structure and routine. So when I have anxiety, I'm feeling overwhelmed many of the times. And some things that can help, again, grounding techniques, as Sean said, there's different things we can do. But meditation has been a great help for me. It's one of the things that I do when I'm actually at my workplace is I teach meditation to people who have anxiety and depression, and look at really simple techniques like breathing. We're all doing it. Congratulations, everybody. You have the tools available to do a meditation, because if you are here and participating, you are breathing, and it's a key tool. And there's a couple different things that breathing techniques that you can use that are very simple that will help to calm your nervous system, as Sean said, to quiet this part of your brain so you can move into this part of the brain, bring your mind and body back together through something simple like breathing. It's called box breathing. So you inhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, not that fast. Hold it for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts, hold it for 4 counts. And you do that at least 4 times. And what that does is it puts your body back into a rhythm. It evens out our breath. And why this is important is when we have anxiety or when we have an overwhelm of emotions, many times it impacts how we breathe, right? The best example I have is, think of when you have a good cry and we come out of that cry and we go, right? It's hard to catch our breath. And so when we can focus back on our breath and putting ourselves back into a calm rhythm, it can really help us to calm our nervous system down. So I think that these types of things, again, when we're looking at overwhelming, feeling isolated, feeling out of control, where can we gain control? How can we break things down? How can we calm our nervous system? And then that sense of being isolated and alone, like I'm going to refer to Sean's daughter again, of writing cards to send out to people. We can connect in other ways. We've kind of bypassed old school ways of connecting with each other, right? Writing letters, making cards, or picking up the phone. Maybe doing I've seen more and more, and I've witnessed myself, a Zoom party where you have your friends all come on the line and everyone gets to chat together. It's not quite the same, but I think that when we're looking at people who are experiencing depression, who feel alone, and anxiety too, anytime we have trauma, so many times we feel like we're the only ones in this. And I can tell you that, as a people, we are not alone. We are all in this together. And so to reach out to people, and I know that there are support groups available. I know that I'm in North Carolina, and the company that I work for is doing online groups for our clients and opening it up to former clients as well, so that we can stay connected. So it's really important to find that way to connect to others. And with that, Sean, I'm taking it over to you.
Yeah, and the connection piece is super important. So like when Miriam was suggesting about, virtual Zoom connection or even texting, however you can connect with another human in real time or even over distance, through letters, is good, because you're putting you're putting yourself with that other person. Sebastian Junger wrote a book called Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging. And this is about this specific topic, about how important it is for people to have an experience of connection with each other, not only to get through trauma, but to heal from it. And there's 2 data points that he brings up in this book that are super helpful to me, especially now. And they're from World War II. And when the London officials knew that Germany was about to start bombing London, they thought, oh man, everybody's going to freak out. There's going to be mass chaos and anarchy in the streets. And what happened instead is that, people gathered together to soldier on and push through the situation. Parents of children had an option of sending their kids out to an estate in the countryside so that they wouldn't experience the bombing, but the parents couldn't go with them. And they did a study after the war, and they found out that those kids that stayed in London with their the family and experienced a bombing had higher rates of resilience than the kids that were displaced from their family and didn't experience a bombing, but since they were displaced, had a lower level of resilience to it. And so, and of course, resilience is that ability to bounce back from something. The other thing that's coming up for me in regards to all of this is that you all have already had, I'm imagining, some trauma-informed care training in addition to this refresher. And one of the things that we do when we're in space with people or virtually doing a full-on training is we have people come up with a simple way to tell Uncle Joe how trauma works. And it can take a minute and a half. And examples of metaphors for trauma have been, boiling tea kettles and radiators and various types of, water balloons or, just blow up balloons. And helping people understand that this is what's going on can also help them start to self-regulate and come back to a balanced state.
Okay, just keeping an eye on the time here. We're going to do one more question for Sean and Marianne today, and all of the rest of them, what we'll do is we'll send the rest of them to Sean and Marianne so they can answer them, and we'll include those with the archive webinar and also additional resources. I know somebody had specifically asked for a list of those grounding techniques. So the grounding techniques, and then if there's any other resources the two of you would like to be have shared with the archive webinar, that would be great. So that archive webinar will be up in the next few days here. So I just want to do a quick note about CRCs for people who have to jump off by 12:30, and then I'll dole out that last question for the two of you, and then we'll say goodbye here. So if you are in need of CRC for today's webcast, a link will be added to the chat box that contains steps to request the CRC. It can also be found on the webcast page within the website, and that website is projecte3.com. You will also receive an email tomorrow with these instructions. If you have any questions about CRCs, please feel free to shoot an email to projecte3tc@gmail.com. And also just want to make a note that if you're interested in the next webinar in the Trauma Informed Care series, that one will air on May 21st. And if you would like to register, again, that can be done at projecte3.com. Also, feel free to check out the website for other webinars. We have many other topics as well, but if you tuned in for this one, you'll probably be interested in the next one on the 21st of May. So that's all the CRC info, and then we'll do one last question here. And actually, the next two questions in the list are about the exact same thing, so we can do two birds with one stone here. So the question is both questions about holding space. One person asked for a good working definition of holding space, and then the other one asked if you could talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah. So holding space is, so as I identified on the webinar, I'm an integrationist. And so what I mean by that is I'm very interested in how various approaches play together. So motivational interviewing is the way we verbally hold space and with someone who's held trauma. And we've broken this down into 3 layers. The first is to listen and learn. I need to understand who this person is in order to understand how I might be of service to them. As they're sharing out their story, whatever little piece of it there is, then I need to demonstrate deep understanding, which is our simple and specific definition of empathy. And then as that's happening, then I want to start to guide the person. And this comes back to a lot of things that Marianne was saying in regards to helping them pay attention to that which was healthy and generative and strong within them. And then also help them start to become self-aware of how they might start to establish boundaries in their life or structure in their life and increase their motivation to do that. And this is going to be a part of what we share in the second webinar. So I would listen and learn, demonstrate deep understanding, and then guide as the relationship unfolds. What would you like to add to that, Marianne?
That was beautiful. Yeah, the listen and learn for me when I am holding space, I'm listening with curiosity. You know, what is happening? What is happening to this person physically? And what are they really saying to me underneath all the lines? I'm not just listening to the words, but I'm listening to the whole context and picking up on, you know, what it is, again, that they're truly saying to me. So it's a skill in listening, and it's a skill on reflecting back, and it's learning about that person and learning, you know, how and where you're going to guide them next. But beautifully said, Sean.